We are going to work on the blocking and unblocking of a user on the front end. And this is going to be done by the admin only. At the moment, any user can block and unblock a user. Don't worry, we will fix that. So let's continue with the logic. First step is that we have to create a controller to fetch all the users. In this case, the admin can click on the button to block or unblock. At the moment, we don't have the controller for fetching all users. So in the controllers of users, we are going to create one for fetching all users. So I will say that list users, which is equal to async handler, and in here I will say users is equal to await user.find, and let's send the users, and that is it. Let's have the route, and let me copy this for users. And unless you are logged in as list users, let's check the endpoint. List users / users. Well, I have to add users / list. Yeah, because I have users at the server file, so now it will work. Awesome. So we are going to fetch all these users and display it on the user dashboard. So let's get into the front end, and we are going to create one API services for the fetching of users. So let's locate get one, or we can copy one of these, and down here I will say list all users as list users API. The endpoint is get, and the base URL is / list. We don't need this payload. It's time for us to call this endpoint. So it means that we need to have a component, and I have already provided the template as users, which is this. So we are going to render this one inside the app.jsx, and I'm gonna copy one of these, change this one to list users, supposed to be or users list, and here as users. So let's see the preview. If I go to / users, and there we go. I think the icons are not showing. Don't worry, we will fix that. So let's look at the component. Here I'm using some dummy data here for users, and down here I'm looping through the users and have some links. At the moment I have commented out the logic. So let's fetch the users here. Therefore we will need use query, and then pass in these configurations, query key as users, and then query function as list users API, and let the structure equal to that. The data is error, is loading, and then yeah, I think we need this one only. So here if we log the data here, Let's see in the console, and we have 5. So we can display this one, and instead of using the array of dummy users, you're gonna use data here from React query, and let's use the right properties as username. So here, instead of name, change this one to username, and now it is back. And I can also display the email or the account type as user, supposed to be user.account type, and there we go. Depending on the way you want to display them, you can display other properties as well. So now we are going to check if a user account is blocked. Then we are going to show a button to unblock, otherwise block. So if you look on the users, we have a property called block or is blocked, as you can see here. So we are going to make some condition. So let me bring back this one, which means that in case the user is blocked, then show this icon, otherwise show this one. All right, so here I'm displaying either block or unblock. So if I save it, let's see, and there we go, we have these buttons. It means that this user is being blocked. Do you remember at the back end, this is what we did? But for the Thomas and Agnes, they are not being blocked, and we can click on this one to block. So now let's implement the blocking logic. So here we're gonna have one API for updating. So I'm gonna copy one of these, and then down here paste that. Remember, we have 2 endpoints, one for blocking and one for unblocking. So it means that we're going to have 2 APIs using useQuery. But for this one, I'm going to create one to toggle it. So let me show you the logic. I will say toggle blocking and unblocking, or toggle user. All right, so here I'm going to change this one to toggle user blocking or block API. So here I'm going to make a condition, and that is in case the user is being blocked, then we're going to pass in the endpoint for unblocking. So here I'm going to have the API here, which is, I think we have the base URL, which is this. For this one, I'm going to have the API here directly in the file. Let me show you what I mean here. Let me copy this and let me show you something here, which is this one. So it means that for this function, we're going to pass in the URL or the endpoint, and then the user ID. Remember, we need the user ID. The endpoint is going to be dynamic, and that is in case a user is being blocked, then we're going to pass in the unblocking API. So let's say, let me have some condition here as is blocked, which is equal to true, right? So here I'm going to have the base URL as that. Remember, the endpoint is called users/block-user. So I will say this is for API, or let me say blocking or block API, and I'm gonna have one for unblocking API. All right, so in here for the base URL, I'm going to remove this. From here, and I will say in case it's blocked, then we're gonna use the unblock API. Otherwise, use the block API. Have you got it? Yeah. So this is what I want to implement. So it means that when calling this one, we're gonna pass in the dynamic URL. So let's get into it. So here I'm gonna pass the URL here, or the endpoint. We are going to implement this logic in the users component. I just want to show you how it's going to work. All right, so let's continue with the API. So here I'm passing in the dynamic ID, and here it needs the user ID. Awesome. And remove this. All right, so we are done with that. So let's get to the users component here, and we will need, let me remove this, and we will need use mutation as toggle user mutation, which is equal to use mutation, and then pass in the mutation function, and here it is called toggle, let me check, is toggle user API, and then the mutation key as toggle dash block dash user. You can name it whatever you want. So here I will say const just mutation is equal to that. We are going to create the toggle user handler, and here as const toggle user blocking. So for this function, we will pass in the user. So here we can check if a user is being blocked. As const, I will say action URL is equal to this. In case user dot is blocked, as we did, then question mark, I'm gonna use this endpoint, otherwise use this endpoint. So back here, let's bring in the base URL, which is this. Remember, the base URL ends with version 1, so it means that we are going to append / users and then the actual endpoint. So here we're gonna use, let me place it inside this as base URL / users / unblock dash user. So it means that in case the user is being blocked, then we want to unblock the user. Otherwise, we are going to block the user and change this one to block user. So next one is we will need the user ID. So here as const user ID is equal to the user dot underscore ID. So now it's time for us to call the mutation as mutation dot mutate async. Then let's consume the promise. All right, so in here I will say const data is equal to object the action URL or endpoint, and then the user ID, and then pass in to the mutation as data. All right, so it's time for us to call this one. So here on the button, which is this, I'm gonna pass in on click, and then call the function as toggle user blocking, and then pass in the entire of the user. Alright, so let's check it out. Let's open the console. Everything is working fine. We have an error that is cannot read properties of undefined. So it means that unless I check by using the optional chaining. Perfect. And now let's try out. If I click or block this user, we have an error which says that response we got not found. Remember that in the API we are using what is called endpoint. So let me show you here. Remember, we are passing in the data here with these properties as action URL and then the user ID. So here, let me pass in the, I will say, data here. Therefore, the URL here is going to be data.action URL, and then comma here, and the user ID can be found on data.user ID. So I can remove this, and let's try again. We still got an error. Block user is not found. Oh, sorry, I'm using post here instead of put. I believe now it will work. Let's try. And let me refresh. As you can see, it worked. If I block Thomas and refresh, as you can see, it worked. But I don't want to refresh the page before seeing the updated one. Therefore, let's use refetch, and then upon successful blocking or unblocking in the .then here, we are going to call refetch as unblock, and they are all working as that.